All right, students, welcome back. This lecture focuses on topic 1.1 from Unit 1 of the Global Tapestry. 1.1 is all about developments in East Asia and is mainly going to be focusing on China, although in a couple other parts of our module, you'll look at Japan, Korea, Vietnam, and the ways that Chinese culture is sort of influencing their development. In this lecture, I'm just going to be sticking to China and the learning objective on explaining the systems of government used by the Chinese dynasties and how they developed over time, and explaining a little bit about some of the innovations that come from China and how they're affecting the Chinese economy over time. So let us begin. Chinese history is generally broken down by historians into the various dynasties that ruled China um, at that time. And a fun way to remember these is this Dynasties song I found on the internet with some other AP teachers. I won't subject you to my singing, but you sing it to the tune of Frere Jacques or Friar Jean, and can kind of help you keep some of them in order there. Just keep in mind that there are a lot of dynasties before the Song dynasty, the Shang, Zhao, Qin, Han, Sui, and Tang dynasties, before we get to where I'm kind of picking up the conversation here. All right, so before we dive into the meat of this lecture, let's do a little bit of background on some of the dynasties that came right before the Song dynasty and events that helped bring us right up to the Middle Ages. Um, Starting with the Han dynasty, which was the second sort of major imperial dynasty of a united China, right? There are dynasties before the Han or the Qin dynasty, like we said, the Shang, the Zhao, but they're not ruling over quite as much of a united China as the Han were. The Han dynasty is in charge of China and running it from around 206 BC to 220 CE, and this was considered a golden age during the Han emperors. Civilization was at a high point in terms of art and government and military power. But in 220 CE or AD, the Han dynasty collapsed, and it leads to 300 or more years of political fragmentation in China. Similar to the Warring States period, in a sense, what ends up happening is a couple things develop. One, a more powerful aristocracy, right? Local landlords, noblemen end up filling the role in a local sense of the imperial state. And these local leaders start to govern more and accumulate more power. And this is going to be a big problem for later dynasties to deal with as they try and get back some of the power that they lost to these noble families. Another big problem is that in the absence of an imperial army that can deal with large tribal confederations of nomads from the Asian steppe, there's a lot of other invasions during this time, and they're violent, but oftentimes these groups end up assimilating into Chinese culture and settling into the various provinces that they invade. In general, this kind of disunity, disharmony, this chaos discredits a lot of the Confucian scholars and their teachings that had been running China throughout the Han Dynasty. And it's in this kind of chaos that the religions of Buddhism and Taoism really begin to grow in influence as they're aided by these migrations of people who are attracted to them a little bit more than the native Confucian tradition. Buddhism and Taoism are also helped, especially Buddhism, by trade throughout this time to move throughout China. The last kind of group of big changes here is that it's also during the end of the Han Dynasty, during this period of chaos, these 300 or so years with no unified China, that migration begins to southern China to escape all these various invasions, right? To get to a safer spot and farther away from these nomads that will cross the border. Because of this migration, there is a sort of environmental transformation of the South due to the spread of all these people down there practicing intensive agriculture, right? Terracing the hillsides and digging irrigation canals and sort of reworking what the environment looks like in southern China. Along with that goes a kind of deforestation to access a lot of this agricultural land and support larger populations with that lumber and extra space. Um, what's implied in that is a lot of species and habitat loss due to deforestation, even as far back as 200 AD. Next is the Sui dynasty, who is the first dynasty that really reunites China after the collapse of the Han. They do that in 589 CE or AD, and they stay in power until about 618 CE. One way that they are able to do this is with their kind of harsh, firm military rulers, and that's kind of going to be a problem throughout the Sui dynasty, despite what they accomplish. Um, they wage wars, successful wars, to reunify China, but then they continue to wage wars against certain neighbors. Some of the kingdoms that are going to become Korea, essentially, Goguryeo, which I'm sure I'm not pronouncing right, the Goguryeo-Sui War, were a series of invasions by the Sui against the Goguryeo, one of the three kingdoms of Korea, um, over a period of close to 2 decades, a little under 20 years. This ends up exhausting the resources of the empire, alienating these various ethnic and political groups, and eventually leads to the assassination of the emperor and the overthrow of the dynasty, which ties back into some of those ideas about the mandate of heaven, if you remember from earlier videos. Some of their achievements, though, okay, things that get accomplished that are going to be passed down to later dynasties. One is unity. The Sui, like we said, reunite much of what had been the Han dynasty and bring unity out of those 300 years of political fragmentation and infighting. The other big thing that's going to be important throughout the history of China and is still important today in China is the construction of the Grand Canal. One of the Sui emperors, Wen, and his son Yang begin constructing about 1,200 miles of canal that would link the northern Yellow River to the southern Yangtze rivers, which you can see in the image above there, the map above. So you had a network of canals that basically attached the rivers that ran kind of east-west in the country, while this main big canal ran north-south, and attached all these major agricultural and productive centers in the north to the kind of newly important agricultural and trade center of Hangzhou in the south. This increased connectivity between the regions in China leads to prosperity, trade, more migration, more communication, and a stronger empire. And the last thing that's going on during the Sui dynasty is a continued expansion of Buddhism, which had begun kind of throughout the Han dynasty and into that chaotic period following the collapse. Buddhism had come into China from India through Afghanistan, and it was brought there in its native Sanskrit form. During that time of disunity after the Han collapse, that same emperor Wen converted to Buddhism as a way to kind of help legitimize his authority, and made some similar moves as the Indian king Ashoka from the Mauryan Empire. He declared himself a ruler by Buddhist principles, established Buddhist shrines, throughout the empire, and Buddhism became more distinctly Chinese as it was adopted by Chinese people, and forms such as Mahayana and Pure Land and eventually Zen Buddhism began to develop and emerge as well. So the Sui reconstruct China, literally put it back together, and also start construction on a massive public work project of the Grand Canal, but deplete its resources in constant war. The Tang continue these constant wars and rule from 618 to 907. There is a great expansion of territory that happens during the Tang dynasty, and there are many other areas that are brought into the Chinese fold through the act of tribute, and that's what I want to focus on here. The tribute system is the name for one of China's methods of diplomacy and control, in which delegations seeking to enter various Chinese cities, usually for trade, would approach the Chinese ruler with gifts of tribute, Could be rare spices, gold, silver, ivory, depending on whatever they get their hands on from where those people came from. Horses or things like that would usually be the gifts brought by the nomads of the Asian steppe, for example. People like the Mongols, or the Tanguts, or the Khitan, whoever was variously paying tribute at one time or another. The emperor would often return gifts to the delegation, and the thing was that these gifts would often be worth as much or more than whatever had been given to the emperor. And it was a way to sort of, kind of flex on these people, because what's really being offered is submission, right? People are submitting to the emperor, and they're bringing these gifts as a sign of respect. And the emperor is giving his blessing in a sense, right? And so let's kind of get into some of the finer details of this system. Part of it goes back to the old Chinese idea of the Middle Kingdom, all right? This is the old belief that China was literally at the center of the world, right? The kingdom in the middle of the world, and in a way in the middle of the universe. They thought that this should be reflected by, goods and delegations of honor flowing into that Middle Kingdom. The other thing here is that the tribute system has a couple different things going on, right? It is a system of extortion as much as it is any kind of diplomacy, right? Your textbook describes it as diplomacy, but it should be clear that if you're reading between the lines here, it's mostly a kind of extortion or fire insurance, and that the unspoken threat of violence is always in the background should someone refuse to give tribute. Unless they had the strength to negotiate as equals with China's various dynasties, which every now and then they did, and tribute worked a little bit different. But again, the big key is respect to the emperor. The tribute system was more than just a simple exchange of goods. It was a way to honor the emperor who had been given the mandate of heaven, ruled the Middle Kingdom, etc. But it's also that kind of fire insurance, right? I can't guarantee nothing bad is going to happen to you unless you're paying for protection, right? The last part of this was the kowtow, and that's where you can really see the submission aspect that's inherent to the tribute system. The process of offering tribute often involved this ceremony where the gift giver would ritually sort of prostrate themselves before the emperor in a way that required you to touch your forehead to the floor several times, right? Just lower yourself as low as you could go. And humbling yourself before the emperor like that showed your subservience to Chinese dominance and respect for the emperor, and usually kept you on their good side and in a strong trade relationship with them. And it is the Tang dynasty that brings a lot of various kingdoms and small empires into that tribute system. Even Japan, the Korean kingdoms that you've read about, for example, were paying tribute from time to time to the Chinese emperor. All right, so let's talk about how the tribute system worked in reverse sometimes. Small kingdoms and tribal groups versus large steppe confederations. What I want to talk about here is that a lot of times China was the hammer and could exact tribute from the kingdoms, get them to kind of pay whatever, and people were willing to because China was stronger than them. Anybody they encountered, due to the disparity in their strength, their prestige between China and most of those countries, would pay tribute. But occasionally, a lot of tribes of the steppe, the kind of grasslands of Central Asia, right, that go from coast to Europe, basically, would occasionally be bound together, kind of forged together into a big confederation, a kind of empire by a powerful warlord. Again, the Mongols are going to be the example that really takes up a lot of our time that we'll talk about in another unit. When that would happen, some of these confederations would be so strong that China would find itself on the wrong side of the tribute system, paying these nomads in large amounts of gold or silver, silk, even women and children of the emperor, and other gifts to avoid all-out war with them. There's a couple times when this happens. One is with the Xiongnu, about the 3rd century BC, so nearing the time of the Han Dynasty's kind of peak eventually. is when the Xiongnu are in charge. The Xiongnu were around kind of for a really long time for one of these steppe empires. They raided China frequently, not simply for goods, but as a way to force the Chinese to pay regular tribute. And the Chinese did throughout a lot of the Xiongnu Confederation's time as their neighbor. The power of the Xiongnu ruler was based on his control of Chinese tribute, which he would use to kind of, redistribute and reward his supporters. One of the other ones, the Anlushan Rebellion, takes place with the Emperor Xuanzong, which I'm sure, again, I'm butchering, who was described by your textbook, by Strayer, as a really ineffective ruler, right? Somebody that spent a lot of time with his concubines and not a lot of time ruling. An Lushan is the name of a rebel military commander that attempted to overthrow the Tang Dynasty with the help of 100,000 veteran soldiers loyal to him. The Tang rulers, the emperor, recruited the help of neighbors, basically mercenaries from the Muslim Abbasid Caliphate. If you remember sort of reading about them a little while ago, we'll return to that part of the world soon. And many tens of thousands of Uyghur nomads, right? Nomadic peoples from the steppe known as the Uyghur. This is the same group in China that you've maybe heard in the news recently, right? Those are descendants of these Uyghur nomads. These nomads arrive in China and help defeat the An Lushan rebellion and the commander An Lushan, but demand all these payments of silk and tea and money before they would leave. But China paid them. It's important to note, though, that these events are anomalies, and for the most part, again, it's China that's the hammer, making everybody pay tribute. One of the last things that we should mention about the Tang Dynasty is the territory that they lose to various invasions and conquest, actually, by these steppe nomads. Two various empires are founded in northern China, and throughout this process, not only is conquest happening, but as your book describes a little bit, there's a lot of intermixing, right? A lot of exchanging of culture and genes, right? Sort of blood and biology. And these two empires essentially are the Khitan, or the Western Lao dynasty, as the Chinese called them. But the Khitan were a people similar to the Mongols, right? Nomadic peoples that conquered northern China and established this empire for about a century or so, from 907 CE to about 1125. They themselves are conquered by a kind of even more hardcore, more, like the Mongols sort of group of nomads, the Jin or the Jurchen, who also found a dynasty of their own that goes on for about a century, from 1115 CE to about 1234 CE, which puts us right in the window of time where our, period of history really starts for Unit 1. The Song dynasty is the Golden Age dynasty we're going to talk about in the rest of this lecture. They're ruling from 960 to 1279 and are a people themselves that are both the traditional kind of ethnic Chinese of the Han or Sui or Tang dynasties, but similar to the Tang dynasties, have a lot of this sort of nomad mixed in as well from various invasions that have moved in and settled down and then assimilated into the culture. Some of that culture is rubbed off, and we'll talk about that in later lectures. But a couple things to keep in mind is the effects of these conquests on the Song dynasty is due to the conquest of the Jin or Jurchen. They are forced to move their capital from the old capital of Chang'an to the city of Kaifeng, and then eventually to the southern trading city of Hangzhou in 1127 in order to avoid it being conquered, right? The other places are all conquered, and they have to kind of move the capital to run away. Hangzhou, though, their final capital, is going to grow to be perhaps one of the largest cities in the world at that time, with over 1 million or more people living there. All right, so spoiler alert, though, is where this is going, right, is the Mongols are going to be one of the other kind of golden age dynasties of China, because they're going to conquer everything, right? All of the Song, all of Asia for the most part. So keep that in mind too. All right, so the Song dynasty replaces the Tang. They rule for close to 3 centuries, and despite losing territory to the Jin or Jurchen, they're still considered this golden age in Chinese history, right? Even though they're basically always on the defensive the whole time. Due to all the prosperity, though, all the prosperity and productivity that is occurring during their rule. Their bureaucracy, this efficient and large bureaucracy, is the source of Chinese imperial strength and prosperity and all that productivity. The bureaucracy of China, of their empire, gets started with the Qin dynasty. The Qin dynasty, we said, gave China its name once upon a time before the Han dynasty, and was this vast organization of appointed officials. They did all kinds of jobs as tax officials or public works coordinators, helping to do things like oversee the construction of the canal, local or regional governors, something like maybe a mayor or basically like our governor. They might work as a sort of imperial official, like in the palace, in one of the various ministries. China had its government organized into 6 different ministries for the for the military, for taxes, and so on. But the big idea here is this bureaucracy is around at any dynasty that you look at, right? It is a major continuity in Chinese history over time. There's slight breaks in it when things are really falling apart, or for a little while when the Mongols take over. But even the Mongols bring it back, and up until the early 1900s, it's still going on in China. And in some form or another, a lot of the world uses something like it today, right? Because the way that they selected the people is what really gets passed on here. The Chinese used what was known as the civil service exam, or the imperial examination, where in order to get a job in this imperial bureaucracy and to ensure that the appointees were going to be sort of qualified and suitable candidates, an exam known as the civil service exam was given. And the exam was based on this list of Confucian texts, the Analects, like we looked at a couple pages of, various history books, works of literature and poetry, reflecting the kind of ideal, well-rounded sort of Confucian scholar. The test itself, though, actually involved a lot of memorization, right? Really, really detailed memorization, where just even one mistake was possible to mess the entire test up for you, right? Lead to your failure. And that led to some interesting things as well that we'll take a chance to look at here for a moment. All right, so, but it's under the Song that this exam was sort of greatly expanded and refined in use, and they actually kind of chop it into 3 separate exams depending on what level of the government you're going to work at, right? There was like a local version of the test, a provincial level, like the state level, and then like a court appointees, the highest level. You're going to go work in the palace, right, in the capital city, that level. The bureaucracy itself grows throughout the dynasty as well. And as that growth is sometimes a source of strength, by the end of the Song dynasty, the growth of the bureaucracy is going to have become kind of too much, a lot of historians say, where it really is sucking up a lot of money, paying all these officials from China's surplus wealth. It's using up money that could be used on other stuff at a time when they really sort of needed it. But that's at the end of the Song dynasty. It's thought that at the beginning, the expansion and revival of this system that the Song undergo is very helpful to the growth of China. So there's a couple images that you could check out here. The top left one there is rows and rows of these cells, basically, that students would take the test in. And there were thousands of these outside of the capital cities, or a couple cities where they would hold some of these exams. And this is one of the developments to actually give students a place to take this test and also help prevent cheating, where it would be one student per box in these kind of, I guess slightly bigger than sort of porta potty sized cells that you would be in for a couple days as you took this test, which was a lot of writing. And another thing that you can see on there is one of the things that have to do with sort of anti-cheating as well. One, I mean, you're one person to a cell in those little sort of outhouses there that you're writing in. That was one measure against cheating. The writing that you see in the picture on the bottom there is actually a set of underwear, right, with all kinds of notes, a sort of cheat sheet that students would try to sneak into these exams, because as I said, making one mistake on these was enough to fail the entire thing for you. So sometimes people went through great lengths to try and cheat. Oh, there was all kinds of precautions against it, such as the cells, such as inspections of your clothes and all that kind of stuff. They said when you turned in your test, you would have your name written on it. They would erase your name. They would replace it with a sort of number that they generated and secretly, attached to your name, sort of like they do with the SAT or something like that today, to stop any kind of cheating on the end of the graders, the people that are going to score these, in case they were bribed or something like that. So that's all just kind of interesting and funny as far as the cheating goes, but the examination system leads to some real obvious and really big important changes for China. One is the widespread use of books. The combination of China's invention of woodblock printing, being able to sort of make stamps out of blocks of wood and print up as many copies of whatever you could carve into that block of wood as you wanted, and their exam systems requirements of memorization of all these classics of Chinese literature and history helped make books a lot more common in China than in any other parts of the world, and led to this very high level of literacy throughout the empire. When we talk about Europe, we're going to look at how books were incredibly rare. They're written on animal skin. They're, a dozen or so of them would be a decent to big size library in a lot of monasteries. And it's very different for the Chinese that have paper and block printing and this test that requires everybody to know how to read and so on. Special schools were also developed that aligned with the exams, prepared students with the education necessary to be successful, and started early on, and were not quite public schools, but were, again, more widely acceptable than educations are going to be in a lot of other places in the medieval period throughout the world. Last was taking the exam was difficult. Something like 1 in 100 people passed the test, right? For every one successful person that passed the test, about 100 other people took it. Put that in perspective, I guess, like, our test, the AP test, isn't nearly so hard, right? Anywhere between 1/2 to 1/3 or so of all the students at all the schools that take the AP World Test are going to pass. So passing this test, this civil service exam, came with a great deal of prestige, and it creates this entirely separate social class in China that's sort of like the middle class, I guess, but they didn't get it necessarily through having any particular job. They got it through having this education and Confucian literature and, poetry and all the stuff they were studying for this exam. They were known as the scholar gentry, sometimes is how they'll be described, and are rivals at different times of groups like the aristocrats, right? Like the sort of landowning nobles that we're going to see are running the show in a lot of different places. In China, you have this other group of wealthy, high status people, the scholar gentry, the people that are passing these examinations. And speaking about that landed aristocracy, there's a couple things to kind of bring up, right? There is a certain percentage of the positions of the government that are reserved for the aristocrats, for the nobles, for the landowners, right? Nobody has to take a test. Their kids are kind of grandfathered in generation to generation. The other catch is there's a lot more test takers in any given examination than there are possible jobs, right? There are stories of 30, 40,000 people showing up to take these tests. And paintings of, these crowds and crowds of students waiting to kind of look for their names printed on a wall to see if they pass or not, things like that, right? Lots of people taking this at a time. But very often, people might be able to pass the test, but it didn't always necessarily guarantee you were going to get a job in the government, which was the actual ultimate goal. Nevertheless, though, this was still a meritocracy, right? And examinees earned their position based on their score, and all the social classes from peasant to nobility were eligible to take the test, and that was really important. It was your score as a peasant or whatever, not your father or wealth, that decided if you passed the exam. That made the Chinese system this meritocracy, right? Where the best people, at least as far as this test was concerned, were becoming successful. The people that were most qualified, right? And not the most well-connected or what have you. Although, like we said, the reality was, yeah, there's still cheating, there's still bribes, the people with connections are still squeezing by, but there are a lot of legitimate examples of rags to riches, right? Peasant nobodies from rural China studying, and their communities pulling together money and buying the kid some books, and him going on to becoming a very important official in China. All right, so the last part of this is about the economic achievements, the things that are bringing prosperity to the Song dynasty. Starting with the Grand Canal. Like we said, this is originally started by the Sui dynasty. The Song dynasty expands it greatly, and a lot of the dynasties after the Song are going to continue that process to an maybe even a bigger degree. By the time it's all done and fully maintained, the system connected something like 30,000 miles of canal systems and natural waterways, right? All the different rivers and lakes and stuff running through China, and acts as this transportation system that unites the different parts of the country, right? The north and the south. In fact, it's connecting the major rivers, right, in the north and the south of China, and allowing people to sort of move along the water between them and transport goods, way more than you could fit into a wagon or on the back of a horse, on river barges and things like that, all over the Chinese empire. And it is going to be these canals really that are credited with helping to enable southern China to become the most populous trading area in the world, on top of a couple other things, right? One of those being agricultural productivity. Champa rice is a strain of rice that gets introduced to China from Vietnam sometime before the 1000s, right? The 11th century or earlier. And really expands agricultural production in China, which was already competitive with any part of the world, and for a number of ways. Okay, first, this strain of rice was hardier, right? It did better in a greater variety of climates. It was drought resistant, things like that, right? You could grow it throughout longer parts of the season, and this allowed more farms to be planted basically in untouched land in places where the Chinese previously hadn't been able to farm rice. They are able to bring champa rice into production there. Secondly, if the conditions were right, and in a lot of southern China where the Song dynasty is centered, the conditions are right, you could double crop. Farmers could plant and harvest twice a year, or sometimes even more if they were really good and skilled, and weather conditions worked out just right. And this contributes to a massive population explosion, right? Where in the 3 centuries that the Song dynasty is in charge, China's population goes from accounting for maybe 25% of world population to as much as 40%. Um, that's astronomical because they're about 20 something percent of the world's population today with 1.4 billion people, and that's shrinking a little bit, but still 40%, almost half of the world living in China at some point in time. Manufacturing, particularly of products that were like iron and steel, right? Weapons, armor, but also tools, instruments, things for reinforcing bridges, even things like religious icons were made out of steel because the Chinese were able to produce so much of it. So that kind of manufacturing, and then textiles, right? Things like silk in particular, right? Silk is the big one that should come to mind, which is actually grown from the silk or kind of web produced by silkworms. That was a very highly kept secret within China for a long time, and eventually kind of gets smuggled out into other parts of the world. The silk industry gives its name to the Silk Roads and is one of those really highly valued items that's moving around those canals and out of China. And also porcelains, right? Being able to kind of manufacture on a really large scale this really fine, delicate porcelain dinnerware and cups and so on. In fact, that's if you've ever heard anybody refer to dinnerware as fine china, it's because China was the source of this really high quality porcelain throughout the centuries and centuries of the Middle Ages and up until the modern day. It's during the Song Dynasty that, as far as manufacturing goes, China experiences what's called proto-industrialization by some historians. They describe it as a set of economic changes where rural people are producing more goods than could be sold, kind of to their local markets. Unlike the Industrial Revolution, we're going to talk about like in the 1800s when Britain and Europe go through the Industrial Revolution with big factories that are powered by coal and machinery and things like that. Proto-industrialization kind of is more taking place in the home, in local communities with a lot more simple tools and being really widespread out, right? A lot of small groups of people taking part in the manufacturing in their homes after they're done farming, doing small amounts of work at a time, but with hundreds of those people or thousands of those people making a little bit of silk on the side, right? Or helping to learn how to make porcelain and selling a few cups and learning how to paint them really well, right? And learning this craft and art on the side is what's taking place throughout a lot of China. And that's helped by some of the stuff we mentioned before, right? The Grand Canal, which helps people in the north manufacture things and send it down south. The use of champa rice and this intensive agriculture, which makes food a lot easier to grow and means that families were able to support themselves with a lot less time invested in their fields necessarily, right? Their food thing was covered and they're able to sell a lot of this excess food for money and use that cash to fund these skills and side projects like producing silk or iron. Their iron production was second to none at this time, right? They are producing something like 30,000 suits of armor, millions of warheads every year, and somewhere in the neighborhood of like 125,000 tons of iron every year. Nobody's coming close to that. 125,000 tons of iron is, again, that's somewhere around in the earliest days what Britain is able to do with machinery and the kind of technology that they had in the 1800s. China's pulling off those numbers during the Song Dynasty. Part of this was because of their really extensive use of using coal, which they'd kind of used for heating and manufacturing of metal since the 4th century BC, right? Even before the Han Dynasty. Although their knowledge of coal and using it for heating or some form or another goes even farther than that. The last couple things we can talk about that really boost economic situations for Chinese people in the Song Dynasty is a switch that the government makes from requiring peasants to pay their taxes a certain way. Traditionally, China practiced what's called corvée labor, where as sort of like a tax payment, peasants would owe the government a certain amount of labor every year. And this would usually take the form of like doing public works projects, right? Building the canal, building the Great Wall, working on roads, things like that. This gets lessened a lot by the Song Dynasty, and instead, when the government wants people to help with a public work project, they pay them. They pay them in silver and in currency. But they also are now demanding that peasants pay the government their taxes in silver, right? That they pay cash money and not just do work for the government to pay their taxes. It's kind of interesting to think about, right? Would you rather show up and work in a national park a couple days of the year and consider your taxes paid, or pay some amount of money at the end and not have to do anything? But in a way, this ends up increasing manufacturing, right? This increases the amount of money just sort of moving around in China because the government's paying people in silver, right? So they're able to, again, kind of reinvest that in buying the stuff to make porcelain or buying the stuff to make silk or iron or whatever in their backyard. And it also kind of encouraged and required the peasants to produce something that could get them silver, right? Instead of just the food that they were using to sustain themselves or to trade and kind of barter with in the market for other goods that they needed, now they had to sort of sell that stuff or make something that could be exported to a foreign market, outside your local community, to bring you back cash where you could pay this government tax. All right, that wraps it up. And I hope that helps as far as topic 1.1 on the economic achievements of China and the development of their government systems over time. Thanks a lot, guys. I hope that helps, and I'll talk to you guys soon.